Dave, shortly after Sting defeats the Black Scorpion at Starrcade 90 in January in 1991 in the Meadowlands in East Rutherford, New Jersey, Ric Flair takes the championship back from Sting, as we touched on last week. And so it's back to Flair, despite the full steam ahead title switch to Sting in 1990, and he's supposed to be the face of WCW in the 90s. Flair is gone by July, as you touched on last week. Why?
Just a dispute with Jim Herd. I mean, they had in 1990, after Flair had won the title, they just had all kinds of they just had issues, and again, it was the same thing. He got to be champion, and then business didn't turn around. I mean, business was the same, and then it came back to the whole thing of Flair being too old, and they just figured that it was time to phase Ric Flair out. So Flair is looking at the belt as his, bargaining chip to get a new contract.
So this is in 91 you're talking, after he wins it back in 91.
Right.
Okay.
So it comes down to where Flair's willing to lose, of course, but what Flair wanted was a couple-year contract extension and at less money. I think that actually I believe he was asking for $375,000 a year for like maybe 2 years in exchange for losing the championship. And Jim Herd, refused, and it came down to, at the end, Flair was supposed to lose to Barry Windham at the Great American Bash. No, to Lex Luger. I think it was Lex Luger. It was probably Lex Luger at the Great American Bash. It was. So that was what the problem was, and they were getting down, and they were a couple of weeks, maybe like I forget the dates, but it was I don't remember the date of the bash, but I know I believe it was July 2nd. They were doing a TV taping, and so a day or two before that, and things were going bad already in the talks. Jim Herd just goes, no, you're going to lose to Barry Windham at this TV instead of to Lex Luger at the pay-per-view, and so they end up getting another fight, and this time Flair basically says, I'm not going to come unless, you sign the new deal, and then I'll come and drop it. And we're not going to, you're not going to use it hostage. And at the end of the discussion, Ric Flair ended up being fired by Jim Herd. So he didn't even have the chance to not show up and drop it to Barry Windham, which he would have done. But, he ended up being fired, which led to him a couple months later going with that was what set up the WWF run. And so Luger ended up, so then they turned Luger back heel, as I recall. Luger was supposed to be a babyface champion. They turned him heel. And then at that point, things got real bad because the business was already really bad, and it got worse because the fans sided with the talent over the management. So the management was like, there was pretty negative feelings towards management and towards WCW. And at a lot of the arenas, not all of them, but a lot of the arenas, people chant, "We want Flair" all night, which was unusual in that time, to where you're chanting for a guy who's no longer in the promotion. So it was a tough period for WCW. And then the other thing is so Flair's negotiating with Vince, and pretty much, he's going to go because he's just had it with WCW. And the worst part of the whole thing, and Herd's under the gun because all of a sudden now the Turner people are mad that they lost Ric Flair. So it ended up where Herd offered Flair way more than $375 that Flair was asking to come back, but Flair had already given his word to Vince, and the vignettes had not started yet, so he could have backed out. He hadn't signed a contract with Vince. So Herd offered him a lot more. I don't know if it was $750. I forget the numbers. I know it was on the Observer at the time, but I just remember that Herd offered Flair way more than Flair had even asked for in the first place. And that was just like the whole thing of like, God, if you offered him, all you needed to do was offer him $375, and you have none of these problems. Now you're offering him like whatever it was, $500 or something, or $600, because you got embarrassed. And he's probably going to go to WWF, and then they still lost him because Flair just, he just was fed up by that point. He had been talked into going to WWF.
Dave, so kind of like a little side question here, especially regarding Flair jumping ship. So Flair jumps ship with the belt with the NWA Championship belt, the WCW Championship belt, and it shows up at the SummerSlam 91 pay-per-view. Like, what kind of, to me, that kind of symbolizes some kind of wrestling Armageddon, you know?
It was a big deal. It was a gigantic deal at the time, you know. And again, you know, it was going to set up Hogan and Flair. That was like the big dream match for, you know, since 1984. This is 1991. So people have been waiting 7 years for this match, maybe even, and in some cases longer, because, you know, maybe Minneapolis people were probably waiting longer, but you know, on a nationwide basis, I mean, Flair and Hogan were both big national stars by '84 and world champions, and they both remained world champions on and off, you know, through the next 7 years. They were the two dominant figures in the business at the time, never wrestled each other. And here they handed Vince the dream match, and Vince didn't do the best job with it at all, but he was still handed the dream match. And I think that was one of the reasons why Hurd wanted Flair back so much, is like he just realized what he'd done. And so it ended up like with a big court case with you know, over the belt, because Flair had owned the belt because he had paid the deposit for the belt. So, and they hadn't paid him to get the belt back. So there was a big court case over it, but they ruled that even though that Flair was not the owner of the belt, that he had a deposit on it as the representative, but that WCW owned the belt. So that's when the case ended up down, was the basic ruling that the championship belt is the intellectual property of the champion of the promotion, and you can't put it on the rival show. So that's where you know, they ended up having to drop the belt, and that's why the whole Medusa thing was such a disaster. You know, everyone thinks of it as exactly the opposite of what it was. Like, oh my God, what a terrible moment for Vince McMahon. It was a terrible moment for WCW because Vince sued over it, and there was already the precedent with the Ric Flair thing that Vince, you know, like Vince was going to win, and he, you know, essentially, you know, he did. And you know, it was, you know, it was Vince basically learned from his loss and picked up a win, and WCW didn't learn from their win and picked up a loss, you know, years later.
Yeah, and didn't Flair, Dave, have some kind of arrangement towards the end there with Jim Crockett where JCP would pay Flair when they wanted to take the belt off of him? Wasn't that the arrangement?
Well, they would pay him for the deposit, yeah. So and in the big huff and puff, you know, they never got around to doing that,
right? Until
the belt ends up on TV, and I would suspect that at the end they probably paid to get the belt back because they probably had to. But
now, did Flair get that as like leverage to control outcomes and basically be able to veto losing the belt? Like what?
Flair had, and I don't know if it's, you know, what exactly it was, but there was some veto power, because I remember in this would have been in '90 with the stuff with Lex Luger, where they wanted him to drop the title to Lex Luger, and he had a certain amount of veto power over it, and he exercised it to not lose to Lex Luger because he had promised to drop it to Sting. And you know, that was the one where they were going to do the title change at the house show in St. Louis, you know, that nobody was supposed to know about. And then Flair said no because he'd already promised that he was going to drop it to Sting.
Dave, so I want to talk about the actual Starrcade 91 event. And so Starrcade has certainly become and was the WCW, you know, flagship program, like flagship event pay-per-view. And then in 91 we get this kind of odd tag team tournament of sorts, and we get the Battle Bowl pay-per-view. What was the intention behind that, given that this is supposed to be the biggest show for WCW?
I was dumbfounded. I was absolutely dumbfounded when I found out the concept that they were doing that year, because it was like, wait a minute, this is supposed to be when you have your biggest matches of the year, and you're just throwing this random draw tag team tournament battle royal thing for, you know, a ring or whatever it was. I forgot what they. It
was a two ring battle royal where you.
Oh yeah, no, I know that. But I mean, it's like there was some. What was the prize at the end? There was some goofy prize.
It's a trophy or something.
I don't even remember a trophy.
Battle Bowl ring comes later, I think.
Okay, well, but this was the one where they had the blind draw tag team matches, and then all the winners go into the touring battle royal, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like I think that they, at this point, they didn't understand. The Starrcade thing. The first Starrcade they did in '88, which was a very good show. But I think that the TBS people, um, and their idea of the Starrcade was very. I mean, Crockett knew what Starrcade was supposed to be, and Dusty knew what Starrcade was supposed to be. And then after they're out of the picture, I think that it just became another pay-per-view. There wasn't the idea of it being like the WrestleMania or anything special, and it was just like we got a pay-per-view, and it's instead of building to matches, it's like, hey, we got a gimmick idea. So I mean, they did the tag team tournament the year before, so it became in the year before that they did the that Iron Man tournament. So it went from being the climactic thing to like a concept pay-per-view. And the big pay-per-view of the year should never be a concept pay-per-view, but that was what it had evolved into. And that's where Starrcade, over those years, Starrcade really lost its luster. I mean, when we think of, like, a lot of people may think of the late 90s Starrcades as big, and they were because the company was so big. But, really to me, like, Starrcade was, 83 to 86 were phenomenal. 87 and 88 were still Starrcades, and then 89 when they did like 6,000 or 8,000 at the Omni. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
Then it was just another. Then it just from that point on, it was for years. It was just another show.
Now, I got an excerpt from the Observer here, Dave, from '91. Just a quick passage, and I'd like you to talk about this being the state of things as far as WCW, their creative direction. Like we said, gimmicking up Starrcade of all shows. Quote, "We're not talking about a normal promotion that does things to lead to something else, and instead one that just runs angles to fill time and forgets about them 15 seconds later."
Which ended up being like the concept of professional wrestling for everybody, like years later.
Yeah, as depressing as that is, just how jarring was it? I mean, it was. You watch this television and it's not sequential. It's just stuff thrown together to fill time. Really, even Starrcade had no sheen to it. No extra.
No. I mean, it's like you expect, like, the whole year to build these twists and turns, and then at the end you get this colliding match that's been in the back burner all year, and it blows off, and that's the idea of Starrcade. And yeah, it was nothing like that at this point. But there was nothing. They were not booking ahead. They were just filling. They were filling time every week on television, kind of letting the thing go, and and it was just a company. It was a company going nowhere. That's what it was at that point.
So when Flair leaves, I think around this time, Dusty returns. Right, he's back in a backstage capacity.
Dusty came back. I think it was a couple. I know it was the winter when Dusty came back.
Okay.
Because I remember, being, the whole Jim Herd story with Dusty, which was hilarious, because that was, Dusty coming back ended up being what ended up, leading to Jim Herd being fired, although they were together for a while there. So because Jim Herd went to Jack Petrick, and he just goes, either Dusty goes or I go, and Jack Petrick chose Dusty. And Jim Herd just goes, I didn't know I remember him telling me the story, and it was hilarious. He goes, I had no idea I was giving notice when I went in there. I mean, it's my best friend, and I just figured, Dusty
gave him the job.
And he just figured, like, Dusty was another booker that had to be released because he wasn't doing a good job as booker. And at that point, but Jim, Jim had just, run his course, and he wasn't going to, it's funny because with Jim, I mean, the funniest part of Jim Herd is that, and I know I've told you the story, is that Jim Herd was the one who, before anyone else, came up with the idea of Nitro. Before Eric Bischoff or anybody like that, mm-hmm. Jim Herd was pushing them to go live every week. It would have been on Saturday night, not Monday night, but it would be live on Saturday night on TBS in a big time show. And they didn't want to spend the money on it at that point in time. And but yeah, I mean, it was he and the other thing too is that they lost a lot of money under Jim Herd, but that's because they were getting no money from TBS for the television time. The idea was that TBS wanted them to be able to break even running simply house show business and getting a cut of the pay-per-view. They actually split the pay-per-view with Turner Home Entertainment, so they didn't even get all the pay-per-view revenue. It was like some of the pay-per-view revenue, none of the advertising money, because that was supposed to go to the Turner people, and they wanted them to at least break even on the house shows. And so they lost, millions every year. And it was like one of those things, oh, you got to break even, you got to break even. And then Bischoff comes in, and to his credit, he talks them into, an $8 million licensing fee per year, which sounds very low by today's standards, for $8 million for TV for the year when, Vince McMahon's making, $200 million.
Yeah.
But at the time, so Eric, makes it a break-even thing, and it's like people go like, "Oh my God, Eric made it a break-even thing after $8 million of losses," and it's like it was really the exact same thing. Right. It was really no difference, but it looked better and everything like that. So I mean, so much of like the results of Jim Herd, they weren't good, but it wasn't all bad. It was mostly bad,
right.
But it wasn't. But he did, I just think it's like hilarious because, he would push that idea to me. It's like, it's got, live every Saturday night, this big time show. And I thought, giving away house shows, it's because different era. But that was his idea. And, it ended up being the idea that turned WCW around when Bischoff got it.
Of course, one of the long story arcs as we talk about Starrcades, Dave, is Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and the rivalry in front of the camera, behind the camera, between the two. Did Dusty see Flair's departure from WCW in 1991 as his chance to get back in at WCW? Were they connected?
I'm not. I think in a sense there was probably something to it. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was direct, but Dusty had gotten fired by Vince out of nowhere. He had no idea it was coming, and he was absolutely stunned beyond belief because he's Dusty Rhodes, right? And he's, Dusty Rhodes Dusty Rhodes quits. Dusty Rhodes gets himself in trouble and then thumbs his nose at him and quits. That's Dusty Rhodes. But Dusty Rhodes, who had done nothing wrong, he'd been given this gimmick to humiliate him by WWF, and he got himself over anyway. And then Vince just, how Vince is with the age thing, and of course Dusty was very overweight, so Vince just thought he's too old and he's fat, and so he just fired him. So Dusty, Dusty never saved his money either. He was just like Rick. Not quite as bad, but like, Dusty would make fun of Rick, but Dusty was close.
Yeah.
If you ever heard the stories, when they would
Gucci luggage, fur coat.
Yeah, they would buy their wives, the same mink coat, try to outspend each other and try to outspend each other on clothes and on cars and everything when they were living in Charlotte. Mm-hmm. So it's like, Dusty was, they were very similar and very competitive with each other. And so Dusty at this point somehow manipulated his way in. But I remember when I had first heard Dusty was going to come back as Booker, and I was actually told this by J.J. Dillon, who worked for WWF, and just thought, just going to give you a tip. Mm-hmm. Dusty's gone from here, and he's going back to TBS as Booker. Mm. So, and then Jim Herd, I wrote that because it was like, look, it's Dusty's best friend. I know I'm getting a WCW scoop from WWF, but it's Dusty's best friend. Mm-hmm. It's pretty damn reliable. And, of course, everybody was supposed to keep it quiet, but not necessarily WWF people, but WCW people. But I talked to Herd, had no idea, and got mad at me for reporting it and everything. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And this went for about a month, and then I saw Herd. I think I saw Herd at the Meadowlands. I don't remember the arena, but I saw him, and he came up to me, and Dusty hadn't gotten in yet. He just goes, "I just want to let you know that, in fact, I know I got mad at you and everything, but your story was right.
Wow.
And he is coming in, and I didn't know it.
I was in the dark.
Didn't tell me. And it's just like, you're the guy running it, and the WWF knows who your booker is, like literally weeks before you do, which is probably all you need to know about WCW at the time.
Right, the disorganization is sort of like Dave Meltzer finding out that Destination America is going to drop TNA before they're willing to acknowledge it, for example.
I don't know. See, I don't know what they did or didn't know. Yeah. I know that they were in denial to their talent, whereas Herd, I completely believe
that he didn't know. That he wasn't working you. Yeah.
Yeah, because like again, a couple weeks later, he came up to me and had the whole thing and just goes, you were. I mean, he wasn't going to fight me over something that I was right on. I mean, that's not him.
So yeah. The last match of Starrcade 91, after all of this Battle Bowl nonsense, is Sting and Lex Luger one-on-one. And Lex Luger, who I understand at the time was raking in 650 large a year, loses to Sting in the final, and he would be gone in short order. Not much Lex in 1992. He goes to Vince as well. Why did Lex depart? He's been a cornerstone of the company for several Starrcades now.
Vince made him an incredible deal, in the sense of it wasn't quite as much money, but it was like no travel, no wrestling. He was getting paid to bodybuild, to be the face of the World Bodybuilding Federation. And I think he signed him to a 3-year deal at maybe like, I don't remember the number, it was like $350, but it was less money than he was making. But he could just sit around and train and no bumps or no nothing. So he pushed for the thing and dropped the championship. And that whole 92 thing was so bad about that too is WCW, again in their infinite wisdom, they had signed Lex. He had a maximum number of dates. I don't know what the number was off the top of my head, but there was a maximum number. And I think that like they got to October and he'd already fulfilled his maximum. So he didn't have to work any more matches for the rest of the year, and he was their world champion. So they had to go like a couple of months with no world championship matches.
Wow.
And I mean, and the big joke, which showed the value of Lex Luger and how badly they had botched their world title, is their attendance didn't go down at all. We all thought, oh my God, no world, because in those days, the world title was the headline of all your house shows. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh my God, things, they botched up. No Lex, Lex is the number. I mean, Sting was at this point a bigger star than Lex. I mean, I think everyone acknowledged that, but Lex had the belt and he was the world champion. So it was like, oh my God, it's going to be terrible with no world championship matches. And I mean, business was it was already rock bottom and it didn't get any lower. And then Lex came back, and I just remember like that whole thing of he's going to go there and be steroid free. Lex is going to New York. He's going to be in that steroid free bodybuilding federation.
Damn right.
And then that last match, he shows up and he's 294 pounds. He is enormous. I remember Kip Fry was in charge, and Kip Fry at that time, I remember after the Starrcade, because Kip Fry was very anti-steroids. He didn't know what to do about it, but he knew it was a problem PR-wise and everything because of the McMahon trial. And he was like pushing everyone to get off. And then, I don't think they had started testing, but he was, they were about to. Mm-hmm. But it was one of those things where he told the talent, please get off. I don't want to test you. Just please get off. And I don't know if the guys like toned down. I don't know what guys did, because so many of the guys were addicted in those days to it. But the guys didn't embarrass him by looking, like Ryback, right? They looked like, okay, like Randy Orton. I'll just think out a name. Or a guy with really good physique, but you don't know. I mean, it's possible if you're genetically gifted and you train hard and you eat right. It's not so freaky that you go like, maybe yes, maybe no, you don't know. It's possible. So that's what the guys were. A lot of those guys were on it, but they were at that level where it was like, yeah, maybe not. You don't know for sure.
Sure.
Probably, right? But with Lex, when Lex showed up, I remember, like Kip said to me, and he was just like, I was so embarrassed when I saw him walk out looking like that, because I don't know what to tell you.
Well, what do you know? So Lex making moves, someone who comes into the organization at Starrcade 91 and is a fairly important part of the scene for the next few years is Vader. He comes in at Starrcade 91 in his first Starrcade, teaming with Mr. Hughes against Rick Steiner and the Night Stalker. Tell us about Vader's rep coming into WCW.
So Vader became a big superstar in Japan by sheer luck, and he ended up actually becoming a great wrestler, I guess because he worked with those great guys in New Japan. And it's kind of like, what you kind of say, where you either when you go to New Japan, you either get really good or you break. And he got really good. He was they had a concept of Big Van Vader, this big thing, and obviously I think everyone knows that the guy who was supposed to be Van Vader was Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior. And Jim Hellwig, right before he was going to go there, got signed by WWF. So he goes to WWF. Mm-hmm. So they're looking for a new Big Van Vader, and Brad Ringens had trained Leon White, and Brad Ringens was, very well connected in that office. He was a regular and a liaison and stuff. And you know how those guys are when it came to like an Olympic wrestler, they would, an Olympic wrestler in New Japan, whether he was a great worker or anything like that, they had that respect that like a non-real wrestler wouldn't have. So Brad was always thought of highly, and Brad recommended Leon. So Leon comes in, and the first night in, he beats Antonio Inoki in, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 minutes with a power slam, and people just couldn't even conceive of what they just saw. They ended up rioting, but it got it got Vader over to, he beat Inoki. Nobody beats Inoki. And then he started wrestling Fujinami as his big rival. And the thing with Fujinami may have been the best, guy in the business, and certainly he was in, the top, with your Ric Flairs and a couple people like that. Fujinami was just an awesome worker. And when I watch back Fujinami matches now, I actually think he's better than I did then. And I thought he was great then. But him and Vader had really great matches. And, Vader was a IWGP champion. He was a big-time draw in Japan. Very impressive. The gimmick with the helmet. He had the helmet with the gimmick, which was a big deal at the time. It was a novel concept. So WCW wanted to bring him in, between his New Japan tours. And he ended up, Vader, those Vader years, Vader was an awesome wrestler. And I remember all those Vader matches on pay-per-views were
incredible.
Sting. Yeah. And especially, there'd never been a guy like, there've been big guys as big as him, but they were all so slow and didn't do anything. He could do a lot, and his offense was so real. It was too real, realistically, because he could hurt people. But it was, you watched him, and you thought you were watching fights, and then they were close to fights. So he was so he ended up being a real important figure in WCW until the whole thing blew up.
And finally in Starrcade 91, kind of a collection, a hodgepodge of, let's say, colorful characters. And I wonder if you can give us some insight into what about WCW at this point in time these names speak to. Van Hammer, Big Josh, Bill Kazmir, Arachnaman, Firebreaker Chip, and PN News, all on Starrcade 91. That seems to me, Dave, to be part of like a little segment, representative of a little segment of the problem at WCW at that time. What's with those types of gimmicks?
That's what they were looking for. They thought that they had the serious wrestling fan, and they needed to bring in kids. And that was I remember, Big Josh, which was Matt Bourne with Matt Osborne with the Dancing Bears and all that stuff. And it didn't work. Van Hammer was a guy who was tall. I think he was probably 6'5", maybe, and good body, and couldn't wrestle, but they just saw tall and good body, and they just thought this guy can be a star, and they just shoved him down people's throats, and he didn't get over. He was like, he was one of those things where, and Vince has did the same thing with like Drew Galloway, I think, where you take a guy, and with Chris Masters as well, where you take a guy and you look at him and you just go, oh, this guy's going to be money. So you bring him in before they're ready, and you just push them to the moon, and the crowd just pushes back. And then, in the case of, Masters ended up getting better. Galloway got way better. Van Hammer never got better. But the idea was, even if he had, it was one of those things where he had the stigma about him of everyone rejecting him, and they didn't want him pushed anymore. It's like if they did like what, if they like kept him in prelims for a couple of years and let him learn and things like that, and just didn't beat him, it'd be one thing. But they kept beating, having him beat guys. Like, I think that Van Hammer probably beat, Mick Foley. And that's like one of those things that like just backfires on you, because Mick Foley was one of those guys that all the fans liked and respected because they knew how hard he worked, and he was really good, and everyone knew that. But because he didn't have the great body, and he didn't look like a marquee star, the management always thought, he's just a guy to put people over. And it was okay when he was putting over Sting, because Sting was a big time star. But when he put over Van Hammer, it was and it wasn't just him, but when guys of that level, heels that people thought were like really good were putting over Van Hammer, the crowd just, the crowd, it backfired. It was similar to the Eric Watts thing, really.